This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
Thank you for making time to talk to me today, and Monday evening your time. I've been really looking forward to it because your book has been a great read. So look,
well, thank you.
I'll start off the conversation. You've spent the last 4 years reflecting on your history and your experience as a leader in a liberal arts college. 17 years at Macalester must have been an interesting time. Can you just start off by talking to us about who you are and how you got to be where you got to? So what was the formation of Brian Rosenberg?
I decided very early in my career as an undergraduate at my university, really as early as the first semester of my first year, that I wanted to devote my life to studying literature. I fell in love with it during a comparative literature seminar on the European novel. And I decided before that year was over that I wanted to be a teacher and to teach about books. And that's what I devoted the first portion of my career to. I majored in English, I got a PhD in English, and I spent 15 years as a professor of English. But as I went through that period of my career, I also became increasingly interested in how colleges and universities function. And so I reached a certain point where my interest to move away from the, I guess, narrower lens of teaching to the broader lens of higher education. And so when an opportunity came along to be an administrator, to be a provost, I had been a department chair and I had done a lot of administrative work. When that opportunity came along, I took it. And I spent 5 years as a chief academic officer, and realized during that time that spending 24/7 dealing with faculty issues probably wasn't going to be what I wanted to do for the rest of my career. And so again, an opportunity came my way to be a college president. It seemed like it was well suited to my skill set. I liked the breadth and unpredictability of the work. And so I was fortunate enough to be offered that role. And then I did spend 17 years as a college president. So I've been an academic my whole life. I have since I was 18 and entered Cornell University. I've never left the world of higher education. I just feel like my place in that world has shifted over time. And I've always seemed to end up where I was meant to be at that particular time.
So when I look at your experiences as an undergraduate at Cornell and a PhD from Columbia, and then working at Macalester and a couple of others, most of your experience has been in private universities. What is the sort of the challenge and the attraction of working in a private university? We only have one private university in Australia, so it's a very different concept for us here.
Right. Well, the US system, as you know, is unusual in its diversity of types. We have private and public, we have two-year community colleges, we have large public flagships, we have smaller regional publics, we have large research universities like Harvard, small colleges like Macalester. To me, the advantage of working in the private sector in the United States was pretty simple, and that is less government control. The public institutions still rely for at least a portion of their funding on state legislatures. In the US, it's all the funding is at the state level. Very little of it is at the federal level. And with that funding comes sometimes a desire to control even what is taught and how it's taught. And that can be a real challenge. Because private institutions get virtually no government funding, the only funding that comes to private universities is through research grants and then through scholarship funding for students. Because there's not that funding, there's also less control. And so I always found that freedom from government, from too much government control, was liberating and made my life easier as a college president, certainly, than my colleagues who were presidents at public universities and had to be beholden to legislatures.
So when you reflect back on your experience as a student, what was it like? Because clearly you were a successful student, but were there some teachers, colleagues that you found inspiring, and what was it that made you be inspired by them?
First of all, one of the things that I tell people about my student days that they sometimes are surprised by is that I was a very shy and quiet student, even through most of my college years. I was not one of those students who was sitting in the front row and quick to put up his hand. I was generally introverted and quiet. I did my work well. I worked hard. I enjoyed it. But I did not stand out in the way that some other students might have. But I loved reading, and I was mesmerized by great teaching. And I was fortunate as both an undergraduate and a graduate student to have at least a handful of teachers who I thought were truly extraordinary. My undergraduate advisor at Cornell, and my not my advisor, but the professor at Columbia with whom I was closest, were both, I thought, inspiring teachers, and had that gift that great teachers have of not simply trying to show that they're the smartest person in the room, but bringing out the intelligence in other people. And they were my heroes. They did what I wanted to do. And so I followed that path. And it was only when I became a teacher that I found my voice. You know, when you're a college president, you are in many, many ways a very public figure. And without my 15 years in the classroom, I would never have been able to be a college president, because it taught me how difficult it is and how hard you have to work in order to stand up or sit down in front of a group of smart people and not make a fool of yourself. And so I had to learn that through the process of being a teacher. And it remains, I think, the foundation of any success I had as a college president. That time I spent in the classroom. And to this day, and I'm back in the classroom now teaching at Harvard, I still get more nervous before teaching a class than before delivering a speech in front of 500 people. And there's something about the unpredictability, the uncertainty of a good class, where you don't know where it's going to go, you don't know what students are going to say, that makes it uniquely challenging. So I learned that by watching these wonderful teachers, and then it influenced, I hope, the way I taught, and then that went on and influenced the way I tried to behave as a president.
What you didn't mention when you introduced yourself is you're a scholar of Charles Dickens. And Charles Dickens was a great chronicler of his time. He was the social observations he made about his times are really quite riveting. And some of the characters stand out. You remember them, Little Dorrit, Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham just comes up all the time in my psyche. When you think about higher education today, is there any particular Dickens book that you think represents the challenges we're facing in higher education at the moment?
It's tempting to say bleak house, but I will I will pass on the easy joke. First of all, just in general, Dickens was someone who was deeply concerned about the tendency of institutions and bureaucracies to rob people of their humanity. You know, in book after book, he looked at an institution, prisons or schools or workhouses or banks, and pointed out ways in which they made people cogs in a machine. And in becoming cogs in a machine, they lost their empathy, their ability to think for themselves. And so I think he would have approached higher education with a deep sense of suspicion. Particularly, it's these big universities are these enormous, complicated bureaucracies that can remove the agency of individual people. And so I think he would have approached higher education. He had a deep respect for education. I think the formative experience of his career, of his life, was being pulled out of education at a very young age. He never lost the sense of insecurity and loss that came with that. So he respected education. He did not respect bureaucracies. And so I think he would have found much in contemporary higher education to satirize and to criticize. And I think that, if there is a character in Dickens' books that represents what he would want to see from higher education, well, maybe a couple. They're the heroes of his Buildings romans. They're the heroes of his novels of growth. Characters like David Copperfield or Pip, who those are books about education. The David Copperfield begins with him saying, "Whether I'll be the hero of my own story or not, I don't know." And it's that constant inquisitiveness and sense of wanting to grow and learning through mistakes. That for Dickens was the power of education. And that's what he would look for in education today, I think.
So you've been out of the higher education for 4 years now, out of presidency for 4 years, but you have a sort of your wisdom is drawn upon in your teaching and your experience. What are your reflections now? And are you the hero of your own story? I don't think so. I think you're too modest for that. But when you reflect on your 17 years as a president of a university, what are the things that stand out both as the achievements, but in fact, the new challenges facing higher education now?
Yeah, I'm always, I don't know if it's modesty, but I have read so many encomia praising the terms of presidents that I've become skeptical of them, and I'm hesitant to list off a set of accomplishments. I do think that the one thing a president can do at a college or university is affect its culture. People do look to leaders for examples, for inspiration. If the leader doesn't have pride in the institution, it's very hard for other people to. So, I do think over my time at Macalester, I tried to act as the most enthusiastic cheerleader for the institution without trying to cover up or deny its imperfections. Mm-hmm. I think there's a difference between boasting and taking pride in genuine accomplishment. And I tried to acknowledge the ways in which the college was not living up to its ideals, but also to celebrate the ways in which it was. And I think over time that had an effect on the community. I think when I arrived, Macalester was a place that was extraordinarily hard on itself, very self-critical community. And I think by the time I left, the self-criticism never went away, but it was leavened with more pride. And I was pleased to see that. I think it is a place that has a better sense of itself now than it did when I arrived in in 2003. You know, look, the challenges that higher education faces now, every country is different, and obviously I know the American context the most, but um, I really do think we are reaching a point in, at least in the US, in higher education, where the current system as it works in most places and in most institutions is not sustainable. And I think higher education has yet to really reckon with that reality, because it has throughout its history in the US always managed to figure out a way to solve what seemed to be potentially existential problems. But I think the bag of tricks is pretty empty. And I think that the challenges now are perhaps more daunting than at any point in the history of higher education. So I think it needs to change, and it doesn't quite know how to go about doing that. And that's a tough place to be.
So, in some respects, I think we're at an inflection point. COVID really tested that idea about change. You know, whatever it is, I'm against it. Changes had to be made about in the delivery of higher education, the design of higher education courses. Likewise, 2 years on, AI has done the same. So there's this inflection point. Where do you think higher education institutions are in terms of, and the people in it who are having to drive and deliver it, where are they in their journey to actually not only understand it, but to optimize the possibilities?
From what I see, based upon my experience, um, traditional higher education has been very slow to adapt to the changes that technology is bringing, and particularly the changes that AI is likely to bring. Most of the conversations about AI that I hear are about things like students using it to cheat, which for me are the least important and interesting conversations. There aren't nearly enough conversations about how AI can affect, is likely to affect, and might beneficially affect the teaching and learning process, and the dangers that it might bring to the teaching and learning process. Part of that is understandable. Faculty are busy; they have lots of things to do, and this is a whole new thing. But my experience is that students are way ahead of faculty generally in understanding the implications of AI, particularly older faculty like me who have been doing things in a particular way for a long time and find it hard to even wrap our heads around the fact that the assignments we've given for so long, the kinds of exams we've given for so long, might soon simply become relics, rendered essentially impossible or ineffectual by artificial intelligence. Which doesn't mean that there aren't new and interesting ways to teach and for students to learn, but we have to evolve to that point. And most people are still doing things the way they've always done them, and sooner or later, and sooner rather than later, that's not going to work very well.
So when I'm hearing you talk, and when I read your book, whatever it is, I'm against it. Where did the title come from? Because as I was reading it, I thought of a joke that I'd heard, but there are other forms of this joke. How many academics does it take to change a light bulb? And of course, the answer is change.
Right. Yeah.
Where did your title come from?
So the title is taken from Groucho Marx, from a Marx Brothers film, Horse Feathers, in which he plays a president and faculty member who sings a song dressed in a cap and gown, entitled "Whatever It Is, I'm Against It." I quote the lyrics at the beginning of the book, and it was a film that was released in about 1930, but it struck me as a very effective way of describing the attitude that I encountered very often in my time as a faculty member and as a college president. So I have to give credit to Marx Brothers for that title, and to my press for allowing me to use it.
So on the last page of your book, getting back to Dickens and some of the characters, on the last page you invoke Scrooge at the end of his visit with the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And you comment, are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadow of things that may be only? Can you translate this, will be or maybe, into what reimagining the future of higher education could be through Scrooge's framework?
Yes, I mean, Scrooge changes the future by changing himself. And so the future that the ghost of Christmas yet to come shows him of himself dying lonely and being placed in this grave is not the one that comes to pass because he changes. And so, there is a potential future for higher education in which lots and lots and lots of colleges close, and lots of other players come in and disrupt it, for-profit actors and large institutions and private equity firms. But there's another future in which higher education does do a better job of transforming itself. And more institutions manage to survive by adapting to the realities that they face right now and doing a better job of fulfilling their social contract. So, the lesson of that quote is that if you don't change, the future doesn't look, it looks pretty grim. But change is always possible, even when it's resisted. And I have seen, particularly in working with institutions in other parts of the world, that when you're faced with great challenges and faced with constraint, it can be an opportunity. It can be an incentive to change. And so for me, the question for higher education is, do you keep butting your head against the wall, doing the same things over and over again, and consign yourself to the dark future that Scrooge saw, or do you adapt and change and create a very different and much future for not just the institutions, but for the society that these institutions are supposed to serve?
So what you're saying, does that require us to redefine the purpose of higher education and the purpose of universities? And if so, where would you start?
So I'm not sure it's a redefinition as opposed to a return to what should have been or has been their purpose from the beginning. Again, every country is different, but I've always seen higher education in the United States as having three primary functions. One is essentially vocational, to prepare students for work and the economic security that comes with work. A second is to simply prepare them to be more interesting people. A friend of mine, a former college president, said you're going to spend the rest of your life inside your own head. You want it to be an interesting place to be. And I think one of the goals of education is to simply make our own heads interesting places to be. And the third, and this may or may not be peculiarly American, but it does go back to Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. Franklin founded what was going to go on to become the University of Pennsylvania. And they did that because they felt that democracy could not survive without an educated citizenry. And so the third purpose of higher education, I've always felt, has been to educate people to be engaged citizens in a democracy, to know enough to do that. And so to me, that's the social contract that higher education has with the broader society. And in the US, in return for that, colleges are afforded certain privileges. Even nonprofit colleges, in effect, get a large public subsidy because they're not taxed. Their endowments aren't taxed, their property is not taxed. And society does that because society is saying, all right, you're a social good. You're supposed to be serving society. And to me, what that means right now is lessening, not increasing, social inequity, um, making it easier and not harder for people to improve their socioeconomic standing. And this is particularly relevant in the United States, I think. Um, Lessening and not increasing social and political division. And one could argue that higher education in the US is doing a pretty rotten job of fulfilling that social contract right now. So I don't know that it means changing the purpose of the university as much as taking its purpose more seriously. The one thing that I think we need to look at seriously is this question of whether the same institutions can be both engines of research and models of excellent teaching. We imported that model arose in Germany in the 19th century. It was imported into the United States by some university leaders who went to Germany, were influenced by that model. And ever since, we've simply assumed that teaching and research go together like peanut butter and jelly. And I think that assumption is one that is at least worth examining, particularly for some of the smaller institutions that have tried to emulate the research universities. The research university model has filtered its way down into the entire system. And so, sure, Harvard has the resources to do many things, including both. But there are lots and lots of state colleges and liberal arts colleges that don't. And yet they still continue to maintain these twin priorities of teaching and research. And it's very different in some parts of the world. The university that I've been working with in Africa is very clear. Our mission is teaching. We are not a research institution. We teach. That does not mean that you don't have to keep up your field. You do. But our job is to teach. And I think at many American colleges and universities, that has become obscured by these different missions. And certainly not true of the way that American PhDs are trained. All of the emphasis is on research. None of the emphasis is on teaching. And yet we send these people out to be teachers. I'm not sure there's another profession in which there is so little training at the primary activity in which you are supposed to be engaged.
And in many respects, it's an apprenticeship by observation. You teach how you were taught. So
it's like learning to swim by being thrown into the pool. You just do it. And it is very much a process of doing it the way that it was done for you, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to change. It's more cultural and psychological in some ways than it is intellectual. This is the way it was done with me. It worked. I'm now successful, and so I'm going to do it the same way.
Getting back to your book and resistance to change in higher education, you led substantial change at Macalester when you first came and then continued to build on it. What were some lessons that you learnt from that? And if you did it again, what would you do in terms of both the process but also the outcome?
So, I learned over time that when you are leading an organization in which people don't have to follow, you need a very different skill set than you need if you are, say, the CEO of a large publicly traded company sitting in a C-suite, and a small group of people simply makes decisions and then say, make it so. That's not the way a university or a college works. The skills you need to run a college or university are a lot more like the skills you need to be the mayor of a small city. The university president has faculty and faculty senates, and in many cases unions and students and parents and donors And a mayor has city councils and zoning boards and unions and constituents. And, so the skills that you need to be an effective leader of a university, I think, first of all, are political. You need to be able to build coalitions and generate support and find out who your allies are and get them on your side. You need to be able to inspire. You need, if you can't force people to get on the bus, you need to be able to try to inspire them to want to get on the bus. And then you need, I think, and this is often, I think, neglected, you need to model in your own way of interacting with others and the world the way you want the people in your community to interact. And so you have to be empathetic, you have to be humble, you have to be a constant learner, you have to admit your mistakes, you have to be civil. One of the things in which I do take some pride is that I think in 17 years at Macalester, people never saw me lose my temper in public. And that didn't come naturally, but it was very deliberate. Because if I wanted other people to behave with civility, I felt like it was really important for me to do that. So political skill, inspiration, and leading by example are all things that are really, really important. I found that change was most effective when it started small and then grew, rather than trying to start with wholesale change. You start with wholesale change at a university, it almost always fails. And if you start with required change at a university, it almost always fails. When I was most successful, I started small and things grew almost organically. And I started by incentivizing people who wanted to participate rather than forcing people who didn't want to participate. So rather than creating a new curricular requirement, I would give presidential discretionary grants to faculty who wanted to create something new, so that I would, and it didn't have to be very much money. In some ways, the most important thing was the recognition. And out of that would grow really interesting things that would then generate student interest. Other faculty would look and say, I want to do that also. So the most effective changes grew from the bottom up and inside out, and were not imposed from the top down.
So when I was provost, the vice chancellor that appointed me was a man of great vision, but he wasn't interested in implementation. He liked the vision. I was translating it. So I did redefined the structure, reinvented the undergraduate, postgraduate curriculum, developed a whole lot of policy frameworks, a whole lot of stuff. Then we started to do the administrative side of the organisation, the service improvements. And we had a program called Delivering Excellence. And Delivering Excellence was a program to improve, the service-facing elements of university operations. This chief operating officer and I found out that it was redefined by people out in the university as delivering excrement. And of course, and it's academics and university people have a really, really clever way of totally derailing something that had good intentions. So the COO and I went to the vice chancellor and said, we have to stop this immediately because it's being derailed. Have you got any stories of subversion and derailment of a major academic change that you wanted to deliver?
Well, there were many examples of changes that I wanted that didn't happen. I mean, the one about which I write at some length in the book, is simply trying to eliminate an academic program where there's almost no student interest. And we went through multiple times at Macalester. The faculty handbook said that in order to eliminate an entire program, the full faculty had to vote to do that. And time and again, what would happen is that a small group would be delegated to take a look at the issue. They would study it carefully, come to a conclusion, and these were mostly faculty, make a recommendation, and then their colleagues would reject it based upon very little knowledge and perhaps even less thought. And so, again, that was a reminder that when you try to do something with essentially a committee of the whole, it rarely works very well. And there were sometimes silly things that uh, faculty had the ability to derail. As you say, academics, we're all trained to be critics, but and it doesn't really matter what your discipline is. You're trained to be a critic of things. And so faculty are very good at that. So I remember we were going through an exercise of rebranding our admissions materials. And we brought in an external consultant at great cost. And he came up with a tagline for Macalester, which was world class. And he thought it was very clever because Macalester was always known for its international focus. And so world class suggested excellence, it suggested the world. And I remember we were in a meeting, an open meeting with faculty, and faculty started picking at it because they thought that the word class was classist, that it was suggesting that we were too elitist, and that we shouldn't use the word class. And that whole idea just died. As soon as they pointed that out, it's one of these things that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so we literally just abandoned it. It's like, this is not a fight worth having.
Yep.
Even though we knew that 99.9% of our target audience would not see it that way, the fact that the internal community was going to push back on it was going to create much too much of a mess, and so we just dropped it.
So what do you think is at the core of resistance to change in universities? Is it an inherent conservatism, or is it just being bloody-minded, anti-management?
It's interesting because higher education has been described as a deeply conservative industry populated by deeply progressive people. So all the surveys of American higher education indicate that faculty lean heavily to the left. And it's one of the reasons why conservative politicians so dislike higher education, because they think that faculty are indoctrinating students in leftist philosophy, which I think generally they're not doing. So it is something of a paradox. You have these people who are socially very progressive, who in their own disciplines are often very progressive, but who, when it comes to their own institutions, are deeply conservative. And to me, it comes down to very fundamental things. People don't like change, and in order for people to embrace change, they need to have the right incentive system. And if you don't build the right incentives in, positive or negative, then people are not going to want to change. And if I look at American higher education, all of the people with the power to enact change, for the most part, lack the incentive to change. So it's true of faculty, particularly faculty who are tenured. In the United States, if you're a tenured faculty member, you are, short of committing a major felony, are guaranteed your job for the rest of not just the rest of your normal working career, the rest of your life. There's no required retirement age. And so why would you want to change things very much if you have that sort of guarantee? If you are a president or an administrator, you want to keep your job. And as we see time and time again, presidents who push for too much change tend not to keep their jobs. And so if you want to keep your job, in many ways, you're incentivized to just keep your head down and not rock the boat too much. Steer it, but not change its direction. And if you're a member of a board of trustees who have the ultimate fiduciary power, your incentive is typically to preserve the institution that you are familiar with, that you went to. Most American trustees at private institutions are alumni of those institutions, and they have a vision of the institution as it existed in the past. So you have all these groups who aren't incentivized to change. The ones who do have the incentives, and I would put in that category non-tenure track faculty, many staff, graduate students have no power. And so you have a misalignment between power and incentive. And the result is the situation we have now, which is not very much change.
So I've got two more questions. The first one is, once again, about reimagining higher education. What advice would you give to your younger self about reimagining the future of higher education?
I would probably, with the knowledge that I have now, have encouraged myself to be less defensive about the status quo. One of the reasons that I wrote the book was because that was me for a long time, defending the system as it existed.
Mhm.
And so I would have started much earlier looking at my own pedagogy, at every aspect of the institutions at which I worked, to think about how they could do better and serve students better, and not take for granted that they were doing what they claimed to be doing in their admissions material. So I would, it's easy to say, but I would be much more aware of the weaknesses in the system, than I was as I was moving through it at a much younger age.
But reflecting on my own experience, working in these senior leadership roles, we are time poor. We are constantly having to manage problems at multiple levels and expected to provide solutions immediately. We lack bandwidth, and most of the time we're exhausted. I would make a fantastic senior leader now because I'm not exhausted. So what advice what advice would you give to a new leader in a time when there are changes that will have to happen, but there are also some of the eternal verities that must be kept?
Yeah, so I mean, the way that the college or university presidency in the United States has evolved has made it an almost impossible job. It's really two jobs that one person has to try to do. There is what I would describe as the public-facing aspect of the job, which means going out and raising funds. If you're at a public institution, dealing with legislators, dealing with alumni, going to sporting events, which are a particular obsession at American universities. Everyone wants the president to be present on campus, and they complain when you're not present. But every moment that you're doing those things is a moment that you're not thinking about strategy, that you're not thinking about change, that you're not, thinking about the mission. And there's this whole other job that the president is supposed to do, where you not only run the organization, but think about ways in which it needs to change and evolve. And to expect one person to do these two jobs, each of which is a full-time job at least, and be successful at both, is frankly unrealistic. And it's very different from the expectations that university presidents had 50 or 70 years ago. And so I think, in many ways, among the things we need to try to reimagine is the university presidency and what we expect out of one person. I've read several articles in the last few weeks which have raised exactly that question. That is, has the contemporary university presidency reached a point where it's just not sustainable in its current form? Is it not serving higher education well to expect one person to do all these things? The one thing we do know is that it's leading to serial failure. College presidents in the United States now have an average tenure of about 5 years. When I started, it was between 9 and 10, and it gets shorter and shorter every year. And I don't believe it's because the people are getting worse. I think it's because of the nature of the job has changed in ways that make it almost impossible to do successfully. And so, I think boards of trustees and others need to take a careful look at what they expect from their leaders and maybe begin to rethink the division of responsibilities at the senior level. Maybe we don't need the president to show up at every football game. Maybe we don't need the president to show up at every student fair. Maybe that is not the best use of the president's time. One of the questions that I increasingly asked myself at Macalester when I was called upon to do something was, what's the return on investment for the institution? Is this a way? Does it make sense for me to spend my time this way? And sometimes that means you just have to say no. I confess I stopped going to as many sporting events and public events because I'd been there a long time. People knew perfectly well who I was. I didn't feel like I had to prove time after time after time that unless I showed up at a soccer game, I didn't love the college. And I tried to devote as much time as I could to the things where I could really add value. And so, I think the question that particularly people who hire presidents have to ask is, where can this person add value? And how can we make sure that that's where they spend their time, as opposed to doing all of these other things? And so I really think a reconceptualization of right now the college presidency is probably one of many things that's long overdue.
Brian, thank you for a wonderful 45-minute conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I really did enjoy reading your book. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I will go on with my day.
All right. Well, thanks very much. It's nice to chat.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You have been listening to Studiosity's podcast, Reimagining Higher Education, candid conversations within higher education, sharing stories of leadership, change, and best practice in teaching and learning. Visit studiosity.com.